Well, good afternoon and welcome to the burning of Brunswick at 300, Memory and Maine's Forgotten War. I am Larissa Vigue-Picard, Executive Director of Penobscot History Center, and I want you to please note that we are recording today's program. Although the actual anniversary, the 300th anniversary of this event was back in July, we have managed to squeeze it in before the end of the year. And it's as part of our year-long theme of immigration. Our speaker today, Ian Saxine, was also with us back in March, and I'm sure some of you attended that program on Zoom. He was with John Mann talking about the arrival of the Ulster Scots in this region. And we're really pleased to have Ian back with us today to address this important milestone. Of course, these events were pivotal points for both the indigenous people of this region and for the settler colonialists, colonizers. And at this point, it should go without saying, but of course it is important to say that we are bringing you this program today from land that was originally inhabited by the ancestors of today's Wabanaki communities. Out of the 30 people registered today, which is really fantastic, we have 17 members and 13 non-members, which is also fantastic. And I want to thank those of you whose membership helps support all of our programs and activities, and encourage those of you general admission folks who are on today to consider becoming a program partner with Penobscot History Center. When you are a member, all of your programs are discounted, and there are lots of other benefits as well. So we invite you to consider membership, and that's right on the website, pretty easy to find. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to make you aware of some other upcoming programs that you may be interested in. These are all on site, except for the final one that I'll mention is a Zoom program. But we will be continuing with both on-site and Zoom programs for the foreseeable future, because both have, Zoom has been very successful for us in many ways. And so you will continue to see some of our programs, particularly in the winter, probably on Zoom. We have a couple walking tours coming up on October 8th and October 16th. Those are Sundays. We actually have 4 walking tours in October, but the 2 others are actually full at this point. October 8th, though, is How They Spent Their Days, Entrepreneurship in Little Canada with Lynn Maria Riotto. October 16th is the Heyday of Penobscot Village, which is located in Topsom, with Ren Bernier, Sharon Panic, and Joanne Falvo. And those walking tours are, you can register for those via our website if you go to the events tab and look for walking tours. And then coming up October 27th through the 29th, we have multiple sessions of a seance murder mystery in the Schofield Whittier House. We are looking forward to having that and think that's going to be a lot of fun. We will be getting information up very soon on our website, and it will go out in our e-news, which you will see in the next few days if you are on our e-list. And finally, November 10th, we do have a Zoom program coming up called Confronting Our History, the Schofields and the Slave Economy, by Genevieve Vogel. Genevieve was a summer intern this past summer and almost wrote a thesis as a rising junior in college, did some superb research for us, which will be woven into our normal Schofield Whittier tour, and really addresses some extremely important issues about the history of that family and of this property and house. So that's pretty exciting. That's a noon Zoom program, and that is listed on our website right now as well. But right now we will get to the reason we're here today, that you're all with us today. And that is this important program. Ian, I've known actually for quite some time, going back to when I was at Maine Historical Society, and we had him do a program down there. He's done some important research over the years at Pajupscot History Center and other locations, and is continuing to do that and share his knowledge with his students, among other people. Ian received his PhD from Northwestern University, and he teaches US history and British Atlantic world history. His research focuses on colonial and Native American history, especially in New England. And I want to call your attention to his book, Properties of Empire, Indians, Colonists, and Land Speculators on the New England Frontier, which we will be getting copies of soon and have available in the store and online. That was published in 2019. Ian was the project historian for the Eastham 400 program, re-examining the encounter between Wampanoag and Plymouth colonists on Cape Cod in 1620. And he also hosts the podcast Mainly History, and that's mainly with an E in it, featuring conversations about Maine and New England in the past to better understand them in the present. And I'm pleased to say I'm going to be recording one with him coming up soon that has a Halloween theme to it. So with that, I will turn it over to Ian and welcome you again all today. And Ian, you'll need to unmute yourself.
You're right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Larissa. It's great to see so many people here. And it's great to see several other august, distinguished institutions. Hello, Tate House and Massachusetts Historical Society, fine institutions both. So today I'm here to talk with you about the destruction of Brunswick 300 years ago, which I think many people don't even know that Brunswick, like many other towns in Maine, was burned to the ground more than once during various wars between Wabanakis and Massachusetts colonizers. And so in the case of Brunswick, I think in part, that's because the burning of Brunswick, like the war that it helped to start, doesn't fit very easily into most people's established narratives about conflict between colonizers and indigenous people in Maine or just in North America in general. And there's a couple reasons for that. And so I'll just say to begin with, the only flogging of my own stuff that I'll do, this talk today is part of my ongoing project in what's eventually going to be hopefully, I think, the first book length treatment of a conflict variously known as Dummer's War or Lovewell's War or Father Rale's War. There's no good name for this conflict, and the working title of the project is The War with Too Many Names. And I would like somebody to come up with a better, more accurate term for this conflict. And I find it fascinating. It mattered a lot, I argue. In particular for the folks living in what's now Brunswick, because this conflict destroyed their homes. So the actual burning of Brunswick in 1722, one of the surprising things about it, I think, for most people is that it was an attack on a colonial town by Native Americans, but none of the residents of Brunswick, as far as anybody knows, were killed during this attack. In part because this was, and for reasons I'm going to get into, this was a controlled operation meant to destroy property and send a message. This was not some sort of mindless lashing out by primitive peoples or anything like that. And of course, I don't think that most of the people in this audience viewed the Wabanakis that way, but unfortunately, a lot of these kind of reductive, condescending stereotypes have still lingered in a lot of the historiography, even about how conflicts between the Wabanakis and other Native Americans and then colonizers are written about or thought about or talked about. And so if we're going to understand the destruction of Brunswick and the opening of this what the least bad name scholars have called it is the fourth Anglo-Abenaki War, because it was the fourth in a series of 6 wars between the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so the first thing I'll say is the Wabanaki, they were both a political confederacy, which we sadly know very little about, in terms of the actual workings of this political organization, but they're also a label for a group of culturally and linguistically similar peoples. And all the Wabanaki nations, they all spoke varieties of the Algonquian language. And so their particular and linguistic scholars go into some of the details by all this, but these were all similar related languages in the same way that French and Spanish and Italian are all sort of Latin languages, right? So there's an Algonquin language family. And so the Wabanaki nations that most concern us today with this story, the principal ones in the modern day state of Maine from east to west were the Penobscot, the Kennebec, sometimes called the Norridgewock after their principal village, the Amaraskagan, and the Pigwacket. And all of these people together they sometimes intermarried, and they all politically cooperated with each other. So to best understand this story, we should first, I'm going to switch to my slide share, got to talk about when and why Brunswick was founded where it was. And the war itself that led to the destruction of Brunswick was very much in part caused by the building of Brunswick. Let me go to my overall. Okay. So here's our overall map of the wider New England region, which before it was New England, it was the Dawnland, as the Wabanaki called it. And the people named themselves after the land. The name Wabanaki means people of the Dawnland, is what they called themselves. And here's the sort of rough location of the principal members of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And then farther east, the Wostuckwiuk, or as they're called in Maine, the Maliseet, over in the St. Johns River Valley. Okay, so Brunswick itself was constructed on land that was purchased from the Wabanaki by a colonist named Richard Wharton. And the founding deed of this purchase is referred to as the Six Sagamore deed of the Wharton purchase, and it is currently held in the Maine Historical Society in Portland. And you can see digitized versions now. It's being preserved. I was fortunate enough to get to handle the real thing back in the day before it was sort of put away for preservation forever. And this deed, like many other Maine Indian land deeds, was it was open to dispute in terms of how much the indigenous sellers, what exactly they thought they were signing and what they were doing. But one of the common misunderstandings about a lot of these land deeds is that it is very much not true that the Wabanakis by the 1680s were being duped or just sort of blindly manipulated by these savvy English land swindlers. And this is not because there weren't some unscrupulous colonizers. This is because the Native Americans in Maine, as in elsewhere, were too powerful to be easily misled safely by the English. And also, they'd been around the block a few times, to put it mildly, and they sort of knew what they were doing. And so the Wharton deed is evidence of this. And so a lot of the text is sort of English, common law boilerplate, but one of the things that indicates that the Six Sagamores, which was the Wabanaki name for leaders, for chiefs, that they knew what they were doing, is that the text includes carve-outs of indigenous land rights within this deed. And so one of the things that is a mark that the scholars are sometimes looking for signs of sort of how consensual a particular document was, right? And so one of the things that that historians look for is is this land measured in units that would have made sense to the indigenous signers? or is it measured in acres, which they don't really care about acres, right? And so the Wharton Deed does map out certain landmarks. But also it indicates that what this was, and this is usually what the Wabanaki signers were doing, is they weren't saying, here, take this land forever, and we're going to go away and never be here again. Instead, they were effectively saying, come on over and join us. And they were looking to establish a reciprocal relationship with the English signers. And the Wharton Deed is noteworthy because it is, as far as I know, the last consensual acknowledged so-called Indian deed in present-day Maine that was signed. Every other surviving agreement that I'm aware of that transferred a land title was clearly fraudulent or disavowed by the indigenous signers, either immediately after or soon afterwards. And so the Wharton Deed is also noteworthy. Well, first I'll tell you what it says, and then I'll get into why it's noteworthy. But it also, in this deed, it laid out that these 6 sagamores reserved to their communities all rights to fish and hunt and fowl, or take birds, everywhere that the English settlers did not physically plant crops or build a house. And so from the perspective of these indigenous signers, some of whom were likely Amaraskagan, some of whom were Kennebec, okay, all of whom had a stake in using this land, okay. From their perspective, most of this land was still going to be open for use by the indigenous communities who were signing off on this. And so an important point to note here is that Wabanakis, like the other indigenous peoples of North America, they absolutely did have a system of property. They did not practice land ownership for profit in the way that the English buyers did, but in the sense that, did they have property in the sense that they believed in limiting access to different areas and resources to particular communities of people? Yes, they absolutely did. The pre-Columbian landscape in Maine was not some sort of noble savage playground in which these people were just sort of wandering around or didn't have sort of clearly regulated or acknowledged boundaries of who could fish and hunt and farm in different places and different times of year. There was, in fact, a very intricate and well delineated network of overlapping group rights to different places. And one of the most important differences between the Wabanakis and the English is the Wabanakis fundamentally practiced group ownership of land. And they viewed themselves, the best way to frame it would be they viewed themselves as essentially custodians and wardens of particular land and waterways in cooperation with other human and spiritual entities. And their land use very much reflected their lived reality that, well, if one community fished all the fish out of the pond, then there wasn't going to be fish anywhere for anybody else, and it's ruined. And so it's not that you had to be friends with everybody, but you did have to figure out ways to accurately and sustainably use resources in an area that the Wabanaki sometimes called the dish with one spoon, meaning, or the common pot. The idea that everybody is taking stuff out of the same pot. And so being selfish or short-sighted in the long run is going to be good for nobody. Okay, and so that reflected their approach to property. So when they signed land deeds with English people, it was initially because they had a shortage of friends and a surplus of land due to various pandemics and wartime disruptions from their conflicts with neighboring indigenous nations. Now, the English, before the Wharton Deed, the English by the 1670s have proved themselves to be poor neighbors. who violated their various obligations in these written agreements that were supposed to be reciprocal. And reciprocal doesn't always mean equal. It just means that everybody has a part to play. And the indigenous goal was to maintain reciprocal relationships with everybody in their sort of orbit. And yes, stronger people would have obligations and receive certain deference over weaker groups. So the English refused to effectively pay tribute or acknowledge that they were on somebody else's land. And so this lack of English respect led to the conflict known as King Philip's War spreading to Maine in 1675 and 1676. And unlike in southern New England, the Wabanakis won. They burned down most of the English towns in Maine, and they almost completely evicted the English from the Dawnland. And Maine colonists returned to Maine in 1678 after promising to pay 20 bushels, English household agreed to pay 20 bushels of corn as acknowledgement that they were on Wabanaki land and that they were there because they were allowed to be, not because it was theirs. And so this, of course, reflected fundamentally different understandings of these deeds, where the English viewed them as one-off transactions, permanently deeding the land to the English for forever and ever to do with what they pleased. So the Wharton Deed was signed in the wake of King Philip's War, and it was the sort of last attempt of the Wabanakis, certain Wabanaki communities, were again for their own reasons to forge these reciprocal relationships with the English. So very soon after the Wharton Deed, the English in Maine quit paying their tribute, and they proved they were not going to be good neighbors. And so once again, the Wabanakis resorted to force to restore the balance. Although in this case, they seem to have decided that the English could no longer be trusted to partake in the common pot. And so for the better part of 2 decades, the Wabanakis evicted the English from the Dawnland yet again. They destroyed almost all the major English towns in Maine, everywhere east of Wells. And the English remained virtually excluded from the Dawnland until 1713, over the course of 2 more colonial wars that also combined with imperial conflicts between the British and the French. Now, by 1713, the Wabanakis were they were exhausted, even though they had mostly cleared the Dawnland of English. The war had taken a toll on the indigenous population. The English militias had burned down a lot of Wabanaki communities. A lot of Wabanakis had spent the war years as taking shelter on the St. Lawrence Seaway in France, and they wanted to go home. And so they signed a peace agreement with Massachusetts Bay Colony, which administered Maine until 1820, as I'm sure most of you know. And the agreement was that the English could return to, quote, all lands formerly settled. Okay, this is what the agreement read. Now, the Wabanaki appear to have interpreted this to mean, quite straightforwardly, the English could rebuild homes where they used to have homes. They could rebuild towns where they used to have towns. Now, for the purposes of Brunswick, this meant almost nothing. Okay, there had been the Pejepsket area had a very small handful of sort of traders and fishermen and stuff, but there was no meaningful town of Brunswick. The British interpreted the deed to mean that anywhere the English had any kind of legal title, however fanciful, from before 1688, before the war started, they could go there and colonize. Now, from the Wabanaki perspective, they appear to have believed, I argue anyway, that this treaty that they signed in Portland in 1713 effectively redrew any bounds of any disputed deeds or any deeds that they had disavowed or any transactions that they had disavowed, and redrew the border to be that the English could live along the coast where they previously had towns and wouldn't go any further. The English, of course, had other ideas. And so during the war, a group of speculators known as the Penobscot proprietors had formed. And they had bought up a lot of the old land claims from refugees from Maine, including the Wharton title. And so the Penobscot proprietors formed to take advantage of the so-called Penobscot patent, which by and large was built on fundamentally the Wharton deed and a few other documents. And it rested overwhelmingly on indigenous land deeds. Many of these, though, had never been occupied by English-speaking colonists. And so from the Wabanaki perspective, most of these were a dead letter. Okay, but nevertheless, the Penobscot proprietors, who were a company made up of a group of well-connected, for the most part, Boston elites who were members of the Governor's Council, the sort of equivalent of the Senate back then. Some of them had connections with former governors. Some of them sat on the Massachusetts Superior Court or in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. These were very well-connected people. And so they set about trying to make their claim a reality on this, on the Penobscot patent. And should be able to, okay. And the Penobscot claim is on this map on the sort of darkened area, including Brunswick and Topsham, and then further to the south there, roughly. And so the goal of the Penobscot proprietors was to grant away some land real cheap or even free to willing colonists who would move to the area and build towns. And then in doing so would make the rest of the patent extremely desirable and valuable. And the proprietors could sell the rest of the land at an enormous profit. And they had paid £1,000 each of the 8 original proprietors total had kicked in, as a group of 8 of them, £1,000 for this vast tract of land. It was, so it was real money, but they stood to make an enormous amount of profit from it if they were able to make this claim a reality. And so beginning in 1715, they began to ship colonists up to Brunswick. There were some neighboring towns as well, especially the Scots-Irish town of Cork, which we actually don't fully know where it was because it was destroyed during Dummer's War and not rebuilt. But there was also Brunswick and then Topsham and a few other little outposts in the area that began to be populated. The company kicked in some money to build Fort Brunswick in 1717 as well. It was right up by the site of Brunswick. Now, almost immediately, the Kennebec, as well as the Amaraskagan, who lived in the villages of Amasakanti and Narragamugguk, and then the Kennebec lived in Norridgewock, they almost immediately began to complain to Massachusetts authorities about what they viewed as these British trespassers on their land, almost immediately. And so in 1717, there was a conference held at Aroostook, on the map here, to hash out these differences, because there were some Wabanaki men who began to take matters into their own hands and confront these people and say, what are you doing here? And started taking things from them and saying, like, look, if you're going to be here, you need to effectively pay rent. So, so if you're going to come and live on my land, well, we're going to take your cow, that kind of thing. And so the colonists, of course, interpreted this as straight off theft. And so the two sides met and essentially talked past each other at Aroostook. And nothing really came of this. So colonists continued to arrive in Brunswick. In 1719, the residents started holding town meetings, and they started keeping a town book, which you can read. It's part of the Penobscot proprietors' records at the Maine Historical Society, because the Brunswick was not yet incorporated. And so these town meetings they started holding, they were in fact possibly illegal. My interpretation, at least, which you can read more of in Properties of Empire if you wish, is that the townies seem to have started wanting to take more power to themselves, to allocate land to newcomers faster, so they could start a school and build a healthier town and protect themselves from the Wabanakis, who clearly were not very pleased that these folks were there. Then by 1720, the Wabanakis had made their displeasure even more known. And so in response to sort of individual acts of property violence to sort of warn people away, the Massachusetts Governor Shute and his administration took four Kennebec hostages. And these were sort of diplomatic hostages. And what made this such a short-sighted diplomatic maneuver, to put it kindly, was that these were four leaders in Norridgewock who were members of the more conciliatory faction, who wanted to try and reach an accommodation with Massachusetts. But the group that was taking power in Norridgewock in village councils was a more confrontational faction. And it was rallying around a Sagamore named Wawerna, and a French Jesuit missionary named Sebastian Rale. And Rale, the British became convinced that Rale, the reason why the Kennebec in particular were getting so riled up was because Rale was tricking them and feeding them lies and putting them up to it. It was part of this sort of patronizing idea that Native Americans, obviously they would be friends with the British if only the French were not misleading them. And so in 1721, matters came to a head where 200 fighters from several villages around the Dawnland converged on Arousik to have another meeting with Governor Shute. When the governor learned that there was this large delegation of fighting men that was going to be there as a show of strength, he decided not to show up. And Rale was there, and he delivered a pretty spicy message on behalf of the Wabanaki, saying like, look, we don't know who you think you are. You don't have any right to be building these new places. You need to knock it off. It reasserted the indigenous claim to all their unsold lands. And so the Shute and his administration and the Massachusetts House of Representatives hit upon the escalation tactic of sending the Massachusetts militia to kidnap Rale in Norridgewock. And so in January of 1722, a company of Massachusetts militia went uninvited to Norridgewock in the middle of winter to try and grab Rale out of his bed. Now he was tipped off, and most of the Kennebec weren't around anyway, because Norridgewock, like other Wabanaki villages, was not occupied year-round. Parts of the year, most of its people went and broke up into smaller family groups to hunt moose and other animals, rather than congregating in this big community all year round. Norridgewock was empty. It was fairly empty at that point. So Rale got away. But so, as you might understand, as you might expect, the Kennebec were furious that their own sovereignty was being violated, and that these soldiers had barged into their homes without warning and without being asked. And so, when the Kennebec regrouped in Norridgewock in May of 1722, they decided to retaliate in a measured fashion. And so, much like other states and countries, there's sort of diplomatic acts of measured escalation, right? But not necessarily going from 0 to 60. So the Kennebec decided, and they consulted with other indigenous communities, both the Panawabskik or the Penobscot, and then also some of the villages on the St. Lawrence. And they decided to go down the Kennebec River, which is near where Fort Richmond is on this map here, and they took 60 hostages people who were living where they shouldn't be in terms of from the Wabanaki perspective. They took 60 hostages from these from along the Kennebec River, but then after sort of giving these people a talking to, they released all but 5 of them as a sort of tit for tat to try and convince Massachusetts to release its own hostages. But then this seems to have had no result. So they waited around and nothing happened. And instead, they sort of received word that, well, the English are just sort of arming men and they're congregating in all their blockhouses and forts. And so after that, in particular, trying to head off any kind of further backing down among their sort of conciliatory rivals, the confrontational faction within Norridgewock and their compatriots in other communities, they instead sent a force of fighters down the Kennebec River again, and this time they decided to clear out the town of Brunswick. And so in July of 1722, they marched down to Brunswick, and when the inhabitants knew what was going on, and so they took shelter in blockhouses and nearby forts, and then the Wabanaki burned the town of Brunswick to the ground, or at least the vast majority. But they also destroyed a bunch of grist mills and homes along the Kennebec River. And this was meant to very much send a clear message that any English trespassers who strayed over the line were not going to be tolerated. And so they hoped that this would show they meant business. What happened instead was that almost immediately Massachusetts escalated the violence still further, and a company of militiamen led by Captain Johnson Harmon was in the area when the Wabanakis had burned down Brunswick. And so Harmon and his men approached Brunswick at nightfall, and they ended up surprising a group of sleeping indigenous men who had destroyed Brunswick. And so finding these people caught by surprise, Harmon's company fired on them and killed several of them before retreating. And so in doing so, drew first blood. And so after several of them had been killed, the Wabanaki then retaliated further and began launching lethal assaults up and down the Maine frontier, targeting in particular Fort St. George, the triangle on this map here, as well as Topsham, Brunswick, North Yarmouth, Aroostook, and then other coastal communities. And so the war very much, this was not a war that either side particularly wanted. Both sides were really hoping that the others would back down here, right? And there's not a whole lot of, well, quite honestly, there's not a whole lot of sort of glamour associated with this expedition or conflict. One of the only surviving records that we have of this attack was of Harmon's retaliatory strike, and there was a local song that was preserved by a local historian, William McKean, and that's also in the Pejepska Proprietors records. And so the song, we don't have the tune, but the verse was written, "Oh, the sweet and pleasant morning, while we around them stood, but oh, the dreadful and grievous groaning, Englishmen crying in their blood. Come, says valiant Colonel Harmon, their neglect is our gain. Therefore let us fall upon them. Our cause is good, we will maintain. On them we fired 2 volleys, and with haste we made away. For fear the Indians should surround us, and we should not get away. Some say we did kill 30, others say we did kill more. The number to us is uncertain. I believe we hardly killed a score." And so even the song kind of makes fun of these overinflated claims and makes it very much clear that Harmon's men fired on these fighters while they were asleep, and then they ran away. And that kind of captures the spirit of a lot of the fighting that happened in Maine over these conflicts. There were very few pitched battles. There wasn't a lot that made for glamour. And it was a lot of these kind of guerrilla ambushes and back and forth sort of bushwhacks. And a number of the main frontier fighters were scalp hunters, where they were literally trying to take scalps to collect on bounties offered by the Massachusetts government. And so the most famous of them was Captain Lovewell, who went to modern day Freiburg, where there was looking for the village of Pigwacket to try and take scalps for money. And he got ambushed and killed along with most of his men. And then later, Maine residents sort of mythologized this into the sort of Maine version of Thermopylae or the Alamo, where they made up yarns about Lovewell's men killing most of the Pigwackets. So there's no evidence of any of that. And he was fighting in a war, and he also knew that the cash value of an indigenous scalp, even if it was a woman or a child, was a lot of money in modern day dollars. At the time it was, I'm trying to remember what it was by the time he went to Pigwacket, but his most successful expedition, his company came back with 1,000 pounds, 10 scalps that were worth 1,000 pounds, 100 pounds per hank of hair. Now, as far as the evidence for the destruction of Brunswick and what was there, we have very little. Most of the residents didn't leave a lot of written records. We have a petition for redress from James Woodside, the Scots-Irish minister of Brunswick, who wrote to the governor in 1723. He said that Brunswick was 4 miles from Fort George with a garrison house. The inhabitants were surprised by the Indians in the month of July, who came down in great numbers to murder your majesty's good subjects, or so he said. But he said, upon this surprise, the inhabitants, destitute of provisions, ran for shelter into my house, which is still defended by my sons, where they were kindly received and provided for and protected from the rebel Indians. And the Native Americans killed all of his cattle. And that was the sort of most common kinds of destructions. And again, oftentimes the Wabanakis were referred to as rebels because from the perspective of the Massachusetts authorities, they had already pledged their allegiance to His Majesty King George. And so therefore, this was not a war, but a rebellion. This was a rebellion of supposedly loyal subjects. And that was part of the justification of the declarations issued by acting governor William Dummer in 1722, following the burning of Brunswick, issuing proclamations declaring bounties on indigenous scalps, saying that they were in rebellion against their lawful sovereign. This conflict raged on in a kind of desultory fashion for several years. The major British victory was the destruction of Norridgewock in 1744 in August, killing Sebastian Rale and around 30 other residents there, although we're not fully clear on all the numbers. There were several Maine towns that were destroyed by the Wabanakis, but then both sides actually were, and this is a sort of subject for another talk, but I would argue kind of exhausted, and nobody really got what they wanted out of this conflict. And the result was a series of treaties signed in present-day Portland, Maine, that established a more regularized boundary between the Wabanakis and Massachusetts for the next 2 decades or so. And again, that resolution itself is not one that fits into, I think, a lot of preconceived notions for how these kinds of things went. And so because of all these reasons, the conflict known as Dummer's War really doesn't get very much attention from scholars. And likewise, nor does the destruction of Brunswick, which again was meant to be this kind of limited expedition that ended up provoking, again, this lethal escalation by Massachusetts militia, which then led to a general war for several years. So Brunswick itself, by the way, was rebuilt after the war, starting in 1727, and then incorporated in 1737. So I'll leave it at that and take your questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. As always, very informative. And we really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. Ian is happy to take a few questions before the top of the hour here. If anybody has one, please feel free to raise your, I see a hand raised by Mia Beal. Mia, you can unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
I'll even make myself visible if I can. There I am. Hi. What about Fort George being built out of stone instead of wood, so the Wabanakis wouldn't burn it, as I understand, and interfering with their fishing?
Oh, yes, there's been some good work on that. So that was part of the program. That was part of the idea. This is one of the reasons why the Wabanaki stopped signing deeds and selling land, is because the British didn't make good neighbors. Because what the Wabanakis learned by 1690 or so was that when you invited the English to a particular place, they put weirs across the streams that stopped the fish from going anywhere. They overhunted, and they made the land around their towns useless from the indigenous perspective. And from the English perspective, if you read some of the records of the Pechepska proprietors and the Massachusetts, House of Representatives, that was part of the point. It was kind of another historian, Alexandra Montgomery, who now works out of Mount Vernon. She's called this a weaponized settlement. And the idea that the British would use their method of land use and colonization to eventually drive the Wabanakis out, without necessarily just murdering them all immediately or something, but rather doing it gradually and less violently and hopefully cheaper.
Yeah. Can I go on a little bit, or no? Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you must have read Zach Bennett's work.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
Yes, he's done good work on that.
Yeah, and it seems like it's been right where Fort Andros, what they call Fort Andros now was a place that really contributed to both interference of Wabanaki transportation and eating, because it was a huge fish place.
Yes.
And his work says moving them upriver. So, then Brunswick could say, hey, we got a name, we're Brunswick.
Yes. And there's a great document in the Maine Historical Society that the residents of Brunswick and Topsham signed. It was a petition for when Massachusetts was going to stop paying to maintain Fort George. It's alternately called Fort George and Fort Brunswick, depending on, because there's also Fort St. George, so it starts to get confusing. So some people go. Anyway, the name of this fort, regardless, it was going to be demobilized. And so the residents sent a petition in 1737 saying to Governor, Belcher, Jonathan Belcher, from time immemorial, these cruel savages have used our neighborhood as their annual gathering place, and they view us as usurpers, and they claim the rights of all the birds in the air and the fish in this river and the game on the land, and they look upon us as trespassers and treat us very meanly. And if we didn't have this fort, who knows what they would do? And of course, if you read the Wharton Deed, yeah, they saw themselves as being entitled to these things because that's what the agreement had been.
Right. Well, interesting. Thank you.
So there is a question in the chat box. We have heard the indigenous people in the Brunswick region referred to as Abenaki. Can you clarify this in relationship to the Amarascoggin and Kennebec?
Yes. So I was trying to keep things simple. So the Abenaki is the language group, and it oftentimes refers to together the Kennebec, Amarascoggin, and Pigwacket, as well as, I believe, the Pennacook, and sometimes some of the folks who lived in what's now Vermont and New Hampshire. The Penobscot were not Abenaki. They spoke a different language and had a different relation. And so because not all Wabanakis were Abenaki, but all Abenaki were Wabanaki, to sort of ease confusion, you'll sometimes see scholars not using Abenaki as much. And it used to be used instead of Wabanaki and just referring to the Penobscots as well, which just wasn't as accurate. Because linguistically, the Penobscot are closer related to the Wostookwiak or Maliseet and Passamaquoddy than they are the Kennebec and the Amarascoggin. And so, but Abenaki refers as well to this language family and language group. And the language that the Penobscot and the Wostookwiak and Passamaquoddy speak is an older name for them. The French called them all the Atemachin, and they were more closely related. I see we have another question about, had many of the Wabanaki converted to Catholicism by the French? A number of them had, in a sort of a la carte fashion, where they took some elements of Catholicism, they maintained some elements of their traditional beliefs, and there were some Wabanakis who did not convert to Catholicism. And there are some who became very devout Catholics, and there was kind of a spectrum. And this remained all the way through the case, all the way to the American Revolution, where we have written documents where, shall we say, less flattering English commentators would say that, like, oh, their old shamans are still here worshiping their devil stuff or whatever. And then they also, some of them have their priests.
Ian, there was a direct message to me question. Why was Brunswick so important that the Wabanaki targeted it for the special ops attack here in 1722? And if it was so important, why weren't settlers killed?
So the reason why Brunswick was targeted is it was the biggest new town that hadn't existed before. And so it's important to note, the Wabanakis weren't just attacking everywhere willy-nilly. The point was, the Brits have a right to be in certain places and not others. And so if they're going to step over the line where they shouldn't, then they need to learn some manners. And so Brunswick was the biggest new area of colonization. And so that's why it was targeted. And again, the reason why they didn't kill any colonists is because they weren't trying to necessarily escalate all the way. And you know, they could walk and chew gum at the same time. And in the same reason why doesn't the United States use nuclear weapons on Russia? Well, because just because you can do something doesn't mean you will, right? And that they didn't want to have a shooting war unless they had to, because they didn't want it. They didn't want their people to get killed any more than Massachusetts did. And so they thought, okay, if there's going to be escalation and intimidation on the part of the British, okay, well then we're going to up the ante and we're going to do the same thing.
Post Dummer's War, was there any Wabanaki presence in Brunswick?
Yes. So we have evidence. There's not a lot of evidence. Part of it was because some of them were there to trade, and they would often buy booze and other things that it was illegal for them to buy from the residents of Brunswick. There were some Brunswickers who got prosecuted at the Court of Common Pleas in the court records for selling, for having illicit commerce. Trade was supposed to happen at the licensed truck houses, as they were called, but there were some from time to time. And of course, that petition made it very clear, at least, that they were there every year to fish and do what they pleased pretty close by. And it's important to note also, Brunswick wasn't very big, and like many other New England towns, the land inside of the township contained a lot of vacant, not densely populated areas. that yes, the Wabanaki definitely came to use as they saw fit. I see Dave's got a hand up.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had a sense of how many homes and or families were affected by the July event, and is there a specific date in July of 22 that's associated with it?
So we are not 100% sure on which day they burned down there. And I checked all my notes before this. We don't have an exact one. It was, I want to say between like approximately the 15th or so, give or take. In terms of the numbers of the house, we don't have the number of the exact number of the inhabitants, because not all of them were necessarily supposed to be there, even in terms of taking land from the company. The Scots-Irish, the petition said that they had 160 people who came over, and 40 families in 1718. Now, there were other colonists from Massachusetts, and not all these folks were in Brunswick. But I would say, as a ballpark, if maybe, I don't know, a couple hundred people tops in Brunswick and Topsham in the sort of generalized area who were there. It wasn't very big. It was the biggest there. It was the biggest new town that had been there, but there was a reason. The companies had a hard time attracting new colonists to the region for the reason that people were worried this would happen. And so the companies kept saying, oh, we promise that we have a right to be here. We have a good title from the Indians. Trust us, trust us, trust us. And then, of course, another war would happen. And so, you know, some of these Scots-Irish, they got bumped around where they left Cork or the areas surrounding Brunswick, and then they took up land near Damerscotta. And then they ended up being kind of abandoned, and then they took up land near, oh gosh, the town of Warren, where under Samuel Waldo in 1735-36, and then some of them got evicted because they weren't supposed to be there. And so some of them would say, like, we've moved several times and we're getting tired of all this, and we keep getting the short end of the stick from these good for nothing speculators. And they also blame the Indians, of course, for chasing them off their land.
Thank you so much, Ian. Is there one final question? Does anybody have one final question? Oh, Mia does.
I'm sorry to take up so much space.
No, that's okay.
I found out about 3 years ago that my direct ancestors live exactly where I live now, in the New Meadows section of Brunswick, starting in the 1720s. And from as much as I can garner, they did not buy their land from the proprietors. They bought the land from the royal family. Now, was that common? And then the other sort of comment is that it seemed like many people in the New Meadows area, anyway, their brothers, their family were all part of militias. And I assume that was very prevalent. I'm just questioning.
So yes, in terms of almost everybody there had to, at least in the early years, do militias. Able-bodied people had to contribute to militia duty. In Brunswick was essentially an armed collection of blockhouses with some homes around them in the 1720s. So absolutely. In terms of buying the land, yeah, once the proprietors sold land to people, they could sell their land to other folks. And so, which is very quickly what started to happen. And so the folks who were buying and selling land, though, usually then they would be worried about, where does that title trace all the way back to? Because if the original deed comes from somebody who doesn't have a right to be there, then theoretically the true and rightful owner could come along and file a suit of eviction.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the concern on the Maine frontier for many people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Ian, thank you so much. We will close it there, it being 1 o'clock. I really, really appreciate you joining with us to commemorate this 300th anniversary. with the scholarship that you have done. And again, we will soon hopefully have copies of Ian's book available. And I know next time he's in the area, he's happy to sign some as well. Thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at a future Penobscot History Center program.
Thanks so
Enjoy
much.
the rest of your day.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.